a very different level of detail with the feedback to if you're just starting out. If you're just about to start building something, you want people really getting into the detail, like the wording. Whereas if you're just starting, you want it to be high level. And so we might say RFC 30% to indicate, you know, I'm still in the beginning parts of my thinking on this, and so like adjust your feedback accordingly. Whereas as you get later in the process, you'll say 80% or something like that. And it's quite a useful way to direct the feedback you're going to get. And of course, so you've gone through that process, you've hopefully brought people along on the ride, and you've hopefully reached a point where you've actually got a solution. In this case, it's not a very sort of profound or difficult solution. It was literally just writing down how Slack should be used, so that we're all speaking the same language. So that all the channels, for instance, were named the same way, so a new joiner could come and they could navigate it easily. These kinds of things. And also rolling out training for new joiners. It was basically as simple as that. As I mentioned, though, the hardest part was change. And if you're at a small organization, this shouldn't be much of a problem. But as you begin to scale, and that's normally when the way you communicate starts to break down as well, then you're going to have to, master change. And it's difficult for you, if you're rolling out changes to the way that people communicate, to police that, especially as one person in a large and scaling organization. So one way that we did this, and I think it sort of had, well, it's difficult to sort of tell what the effects were, but I think it would have been a lot worse without it, is that for each channel, we gave it an owner. And that channel owner was basically responsible for the quality of that channel and making sure the rules are abided. I think it happens to a greater and lesser degree depending on the person. So where are we now? Can anyone guess what this chart shows? This shows where people are reading messages. So the red line shows direct messages, and the purple line shows in public channels. And what we are seeing is that over time, despite transparency being one of our core values, that we were trending towards a less transparent organization, more and more reading happening privately rather than publicly. And then the inflection point, which is just sort of before June 2018, was when we rolled out these changes, which was literally just writing down how people should communicate, when it's okay to send something in a private message rather than publicly. We weren't actually trying to affect transparency, but that simple act averted the trend. And so the key point here is if you don't actively start trying to shape these kinds of things, then you'll trend in a particular direction, whether you want to or not. And this actually makes sense because new people, they join an organization, they're scared of putting something up in a public channel where there are hundreds of potential readers. And so they just start direct messaging. And if they've never read a document which says this is when you're allowed to direct message, but otherwise you default to transparency, then this is what starts happening over time. So we weren't, this wasn't something that I was intending, but it's a very happy result. Broadly, though, with internal comms, it's quite difficult to measure the success of your campaigns. So you can look at employee engagement and stuff like that. But quantitative data is limited. I don't think really that should be the case. I think Slack, for instance, can do a lot more. I'd like to be digging into sort of how many words we're sending on average per message, how many replies to each post, basically to look at the efficiency of our communication. Are we getting better and better at this? Because by way of example, we've now got over 600 people in our general channel. So each post in there roughly consumes about a day in reading time. And it would be great if we could get to a place where we could truly measure how efficiently we're communicating. But unfortunately, that's often quite difficult. One thing that sort of makes me feel somewhat positive about the changes is that we talk about different problems now. And funnily enough, it's the same kind of problem, but with a different kind of thing. So right now, a problem we're facing is where we store our knowledge, where we store our content. So we use Google Docs and Drive. We put things in Notion. We put things in Confluence. We put things in Dropbox Paper. We have all of these different teams and people basically working in different places. It makes it difficult to understand how you should work, where you should find things, etc. So it really slows down the organization. And you have major problems when people are using the same kind of tool for the same kind of thing, but they're using different tools. And that's something that should be avoided. So now we're going over a thing where we consolidate into one of those things. So again, we're using a tool consistently and a single tool. So yeah, the thing that is going to break is consistency, but there is like another dynamic here, which is that ideally you want to allow people and teams to experiment with different ways of communicating. They might come across a tool that is more effective than the tool that the rest of your company is using, and you don't want to lose that opportunity. But as those things begin to develop, and as you see like multiple people and teams using lots of different similar tools, then you need to rein that back in. Otherwise, it's going to really slow down your organization. So that's a little bit on internal comms. Hope that there's some tidbits in there that may help you. If you've got any questions? Cheers. Where's Nudge?
Cool. Awesome. Yep, testing. Yeah, it's fine. Fine. Cool. Are you gonna? Do you?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
we're gonna want the mic.
Yeah.
What's happening? I don't understand this.
So my question was about communicating the transparency value that you suggest, and do you use an application? Is it are you using Trello for publicising what's going on with the business so that everybody can keep up to date?
Do you mean our roadmap?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Essentially for internal communications as to what's going on in the business. It's something that I'm finding as a business that with multiple locations and
Yes.
people across multiple locations, that you need to try and communicate what's going on with the business and changes that are happening with the business to everybody equally.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
how do you do that at Monzo?
The Trello, we've retired it very recently, actually. Up until now, up until a few months ago, in the last year, it was a very effective tool. At one point, we realized that actually it wasn't going to scale with the amount of new things happening at Monzo, basically. So what we have now is something called Making Monzo, and that is, it's within the app. So there's like an interactive roadmap in the app that you can follow certain things. And if you choose to follow some of those things, you will now get feed items like in your feed to notify you when there's updates to those products. Making Monzo also goes across the newsletter and the separate Making Monzo Twitter account. So it's that's basically the new brand for people who really want to follow what's happening within the app. Wherever you see Making Monzo, you'll know it's about product updates. So, yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very useful. How do you integrate external communications in your internal communications? And how do you connect the internal communications and external communications to a specific project? Is there a way to do that?
So I think, and I'm not in the marketing community team, so this is just more based on me having a look from the outside. But what we try to do when we speak publicly is really just to sort of throw up a lens on what we're actually doing internally. And if you talk transparently and allow people sort of access all across the organization, then it means if you've got sort of like capable people within your marketing team and you give them like accountability and responsibility just to say like go and find the stories and then just go and like share them with the rest of the world, they're able to. The massive caveat to that, which is kind of what I was getting at, is there's so much going on. So actually trying to filter through the noise is difficult. So they'll probably need to, have regular check-ins with particular people within teams that they think are, about to sort of produce good work. I also think it's incumbent on like the teams who are, they're doing things which are potentially worthy of a story to be thinking about that, to be thinking like how can we best publicize this to the world. So I kind of think it's a two-way flow, and you just want to kind of make sure that the parties are equally engaged in bringing those stories to life.
Yeah. I think I just want to weigh in that I think it's one of the things that people love about us the most is our commitment to radical transparency, and that means that the default is that we should be thinking about how we can share something and that we can share something rather than assuming that things can't be shared. So the systems in place, if you feel like something is potentially could go either way, then we have robust structures in place internally to double check that. But for the most part, actually, most people are free to speak on anything that happens in the company to any of our customers or the wider public. So, and I think that's really cool.
Oh, sorry.
I think I can probably just speak loud enough, right?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, that was my bad.
So you mentioned you're in a business operations role and you tackle different business problems. What's your process? How do you decide what to measure for internal communications? So the example you gave was potentially you might explore efficiency of communication, but I imagine that comes with a trade-off, because if people are more efficient, potentially trust might go down. So what's your thought process for how we measure internal comms?
I think like with most things, you want to start with the problem, the key problems that you're trying to solve, and then if you find like an appropriate metric that can actually give you a good read on whether you're able to change that really important problem, then that's fantastic. I think that can be really difficult though with internal comms, because I think finding suitable metrics is really, really challenging. And I think it comes down to the tools you've got and the problems you're solving. And sometimes it's not available. Sometimes you're going to need to work on sort of like some qualitative data. So you might run a survey before you release a suite of changes, and then actually measure it afterwards and see like if there are any changes in, I don't know, how well you think we're communicating. But at least, yeah, from my experience, there's not really sort of a silver bullet. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I keep stitching you up, mate.
Hi. I thought it was really interesting the way you were saying that you could kind of request the level of feedback you would get back. And just, I could imagine that people would see their level of feedback as, it's kind of a personal thing or difficult to quantify. So I was wondering how you deal with that. And also, is there ever instances where people think that someone requires a different level of feedback than that they've asked for?
Yeah, I mean, I think depending on like the nature of the brains, I suppose, that you're working with, they might say, well, I don't know if this is 20% or kind of like 30%. If you're working with people who are extremely sort of like rational, for want of a better word, in that case, maybe come up with sort of like a difference in where you're like, this is early stage, this is mid stage, this is kind of late stage. But also, it's just meant to be indicative, like whether it's kind of 20% or 30%, 40%, that's still markedly different from like being at kind of the 80% stage. So yeah, that's sort of how I'd approach that kind of problem.
Just hold it down, you need the mic? Okay, sure. Hey, so in an organization with radical transparency, how do you balance I think two things. One, the opinion of like really highly paid and senior people who like now have insight into everything going on, and thus like the ability to put an opinion into everything going on. And two, how do you balance like or prevent over iteration on like work if everyone can comment? And just to crystallize that, like in professional services, the more senior people who have an opinion on something, like the more painful something will be, and like not necessarily a good answer. So like, how do you think about like, how do you restrain your senior executives, I guess, in a culture where everyone has an input on everything?
So the way we approach decision making at Monzo is we like the decisions to be made at the lowest level possible, as close to the work as possible, where the people who are most familiar with the problems and have like maximum context are able to answer the problems. And then that helps us avoid that kind of issue where you have someone who's actually lacking in a lot of that from deciding. Now, of course, there are like some decisions that they should get involved with, but that generally means they actually really need to get close to the actual problem. And obviously they're free to input as well, but then the decision maker who's close to the problem should treat that as an input. So that's kind of how we deal with that. And then when it comes to like the iterations, there's still, basically you quite quickly learn that although you'd like to get involved in a lot of different discussions, you simply don't have time. So that's kind of one of the things you see with Slack, like you get into all of these different channels and then you realize over time that actually I can't really handle this and I've just got to get on with what's on my plate. So I don't think we need to, that's not something we've ever really needed to actively manage. And whenever people have had the capacity to get involved, I don't think it's really, I've ever seen it sort of done in a way that kind of isn't helpful. It's another input for the decision maker to be able to hopefully make the best possible decision.
Yeah.
Sorry, Will, can you just clarify that? In terms of decision-making process at the lowest level, still somebody accountable for that, or how would that work? Who ultimately is going to make a decision?
So the question is, who's going to make the decision and is someone accountable for that?
Yeah.
What do you mean by accountable?
Well, like you said that it's done at the lowest level.
Yeah.
And people close to, close to the need essentially, and who sees it. But
Well, I think
does somebody take responsibility for a decision?
if you look at our largest team, which is customer operations, and something needs to change, then people who are maybe at higher levels or executive levels, they will ensure that they talk to as many people who are doing that work and who have opinions on what needs to change, then those decisions can be made. It's not going to be like, I think you're all wrong and I'm going to do this. Like, it will be considered, and there will be people accountable through the chain, but who very much listen to what the people doing the work have to say. So.
So generally, though, we're trying to give kind of accountability and responsibility to those people. So if you take a decision and then like it goes wrong, you are sort of accountable for that. There's also this notion of like an accountable executive, though, as well.
Yeah.
So if you're facing a major decision and you're within the operations world, then you'd probably go and reach out to the COO so that they're kept abreast. But most of the time, they'll just be like, okay, I know. And they're officially accountable for it, but it's still that person's decision to go and run with it.
It really depends on the people, I think, as well. And I'm consistently blown away by the humility of people like our CEO Tom and co-founders like Jonas, who regularly actually stand up and say, actually, we were wrong about this. Let's try something else. And whether it was something that they had a huge amount of involvement with or not, they have that ability to take the accountability for it. So.
Yeah. There are very few decisions which are irreversible. And you kind of look at sort of along kind of different spectrum, like, is this reversible? Is it a high impact? And so if you're facing one of those decisions, like, should we switch, I don't know, from MasterCard to Visa or something like that, then you're going to involve an awful lot of people. But there's very few decisions which really are at that level. And so I think that helps a lot.
Yeah. Also, I think that the way that we tend to iterate on any major changes by starting small and then continuing. There's very rarely a decision where it's like, this is going to affect everybody and we're going to do it all at once. That's not how Monzo operates. So we always start small and then scale things out and see how they evolve over time. So that helps as well.
Hi. You said you have a set of rules now for communication. How do you enforce them? And have you had any problems with people not following them?
Will is the Slack police.
I don't know how it's happened. I've become Slack police, bashing people for the wrong use of emojis. No, but seriously, I mean, at the beginning, there are a lot of reminders. I might stand up at the all hands, which is where we all gather like weekly, and just sort of give a reminder or some pointers. It's generally down to the channel owners, though, to enforce sort of the norms of how they want their channels to be used. And so there are sort of like mixed results, but we have quite a feedback-driven culture, so people are generally quite happy to sort of, they're happy to point people in the right direction. So I think it works pretty well. I think it probably could work better though.
Yeah. Also, things do change all the time as the company scales and we get a lot more people, so it's something that's consistently being looked at. And we kind of have this thing where if something is not a major change, but it's perhaps hurtful or could be offensive to like a small group of people, but it's not going to affect the wider organization, we'll say, okay, we don't do that anymore. That's not something that we do. So recently, actually, there was a couple of emojis, custom emojis in Slack, and some people pointed out these are potentially not things we should be using, and like most people probably wouldn't even know. And it was only a couple of people. Then we were like, okay, well, yeah, we'll get rid of them. It's not a big deal. So, but if it makes people feel more included, then that's what we do.
Where are we going?
So a lot of companies have a meeting problem where they'll have lots and lots of meetings. And that's how they communicate information around them. Do you find that your use of Slack or the way that you're working, it sounds like, does that have an effect on the number of meetings or rules around when to have a meeting and not to have a meeting? Does that play into the fact that you have multiple locations that you have to communicate across and people potentially not in the office?
Well, all of our meetings are accessible via Hangouts for a start, and that will always be properly transcribed and available to everyone because we have a lot of remote workers. So we need to be inclusive for all of our remote workers. As to whether it increases or decreases the amount of meetings, I don't know. Will, what do you think on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I've never worked in a company like this, so I wouldn't know kind of what the like-for-like comparison would be. But yes, I mean, we have a problem with meetings. We have a problem with meetings, as you scale, like the number of meetings that people want to have just like sort of grows exponentially and you get clogged. If I was still working kind of on internal comms, then I think probably the next thing I'd love to look at is meetings. I think there's some pretty good advice on it, but each meeting needs like a clear purpose, clear objectives, everything like that. And occasionally we send around like some articles on it to try to remind people. But that doesn't mean that meetings, there are too many meetings and often they're quite fatty in of themselves. They're not as lean as they can be. I'd love us to do some fairly radical things just to reset, have a month where all recurring meetings are binned just to see what happens. Like, which ones do we actually really need? It'd be quite a useful learning. Or, some companies they have a meeting-free day, which I think is sort of quite powerful. That sort of happens a bit ad hoc because we have work from home every other Friday, and that tends to be quite a light meeting day, and people are always amazed by what they can get done. So, yeah, I mean, I think we have some good meetings, but also as you scale, the use of a particular meeting actually becomes like less useful. So I think it's just one of those things you kind of got to constantly monitor, and I'd love to reset to zero.
I think also I don't know the metrics on how often this happens, but I have noticed that some people who typically have a lot of meetings have started doing something where they'll block out certain hours of their time on certain days and be like, this is the time where you can come and see me and ask something, and it doesn't need to be a meeting. We can just have a quick discussion about it. And yeah, I think that works for a lot of people. So.
Yeah. We've got a couple of fun. Yeah.
First, I was wondering about, you said you were using Google Drive and Dropbox and all these things to kind of like exchange files. So isn't this like a security issue here? Because you guys are a bank and kind of like spreading yourself a bit all over those platforms. Some of them are not necessarily very security.
So I'm not a security expert, but we've got some security whizzes in the company. And so I think... Okay, it was like we use lots of different types of software, Google Drive, Dropbox, Paper, etc. We're a bank. Are those pieces of software secure enough for us to use? I hope so. But no, we've got like a really bright bunch of people working in the security team, and they basically vet the services that we're allowed to use. And so they've all gone through like our vetting. And also like in the case of Google, for instance, we also We use it for email and stuff like that. This all has to go through the regulators and stuff like that. We need to make sure that these core services we're using are up to scratch. So it's above board.
Yeah, I think the more pressing issue regarding all the things we use is actually the lack of clarity about what we use certain platforms for, and that's an ongoing effort that's going on right now, where we sort of figure that out and probably, hopefully, streamline so we're not using as many different services more than we need to. So.
Okay. And maybe just a remark on, because you mentioned that you had issues pinpointing those keywords in the conversation that you wanted to monitor in a way that Slack did not give you the power to analyze necessarily those sort of things. Have you, maybe it's already in your process, working process, have you considered putting compulsory hashtags for specific words so that it helps you to classify specific conversations?
Yeah, so the question is, like, would we use hashtags to sort of classify particular conversations? Sorry if I wasn't clear. It was less about the themes of conversations. I was more interested in, like, the metrics and, like, of the underlying units, like sort of words per message and that kind of thing. I mean, potentially there are some interesting, like, if we see, I don't know, particular words which are trending a lot, maybe that indicates that there should be a channel created for that particular topic or something like that. There probably is some interesting stuff we could do, but I haven't considered it yet.
Yeah, and also the metrics are relative to whichever channel is in being discussed. So if you have 100 messages that pop up in the security channel, it's a bit more of an issue than if there's 100 in pets, right?
Yeah, pets is a great channel.
That is the best channel. Everybody knows it's the best channel.
Yeah, please.
I will. Thank you very much for the talk. It's really interesting to hear about how you improve internal communication. My question was, I think last week you had the CEO of Free Trade on your blog.
We did.
I thought that was quite interesting because they're launching a product which is the stocks and shares ISA. They're looking to launch that. I thought that's something quite useful for Monzo to have.
Yeah.
So my question is kind of, is there a plan to launch a stocks and shares ISA and to derive significant revenue from it in the future?
I think in terms of product, we're sort of at that point in a year where we're actually going to figure out what we're doing in 2019, and there's so many different things going on that plan is going to be something that comes together over the next, probably January, to be honest, and we're going to lay out the yearly goals and the quarterly goals. So I don't know if we'll launch any kind of product like what you've said in anytime soon, but we have a ton of ideas, so it's not out of the loop. In terms of free trade and companies like that, actually, our community, it's probably, I think, the biggest fintech forum that there is. And so we invite all these different companies in the space, whether they have overlap with something we already do or want to do in the future or not. It's not a problem for us. We want to learn from them. We want them to be able to learn from us, and companies of different sizes. I mean, we had TransferWise do a similar thing to what Free Trade did on our forum, and they are a huge company. Obviously, Free Trade right now is a much smaller company, but that's, there's always things that we can all learn from each other, and that's, I think, something that we want to encourage more. So.
Cool. Last one. What's that? No.
Is that?
I was just wondering whether you identified sort of internal jargon building at Monzo, whether you've had any effort to de-jargonify to make it easier for new starters and anyone else to work out what's being said in the channels.
Yeah, so the question is, are we doing anything to rid ourselves of jargon and sort of help new starters with the jargon problem? Every so often, Tom or someone else will send around Elon Musk's really good post about acronyms. If you haven't seen it, it's worth a read. He's a bit cookie, but he's spot on about that. And no, we don't really have any efforts to deal with jargon, or at least none that I can think of. But I think, when you come into a team, hopefully the team members are there trying to sort of fill you in as quickly as possible on the context. And hopefully we avoid jargon as well. We try to use kind of the official terms where possible, or at least that's what I observe.
Yeah, I think our Harry, who's our head of writing and wrote our tone of voice, he's really good at that, breaking things down into very simple terms that everybody should be able to understand. And I also think it helps that in our hiring, we've never just looked for people that have already come from other banks or have financial experience or anything like that. You know, it doesn't matter your background as long as you have the skills to be able to do the job you're applying for. So we have lots of people from all kinds of different backgrounds, and so they don't know this jargon that might have been built up over like years and years and years in other companies. They don't come into the company with that attitude. So I think we've always been pretty jargon free. I've certainly never seen it being an issue for us.
Yeah. Yeah, so.
I think
Cool.
that's all the questions we've got time for. So thank you all for coming out.
Cheers.
It's been round of applause for Will. His talk was great, wasn't it?
Thank you very much.
This is our last open office of the year, but we do have other community events going on. There's going to be some stuff happening around the country. Make sure you go to monzo.com/community, and there's like a list there. And if there's something that appeals, then feel free to sign up. Drinks, if there's any food left, hang out. Music's coming back on. Thank you all for coming out.